Good evening and welcome to A Chesapeake Perspective. My name is David Sikorsky and I'm the Executive Director of Coastal Conservation Association Maryland. I'm proud to be one of the many sponsors and partners bringing this series together now for the second year. Of course, this is part 3. Earlier this year, Lenny and the team hosted a conversation around invasive species and then also around access and expanding angler access into the future. Well, habitat is such an important part of expanding angler access and understanding how we manage an estuary that does have invasive species or just our native species that we care so much about. At CCA, we spend a lot of time building reef balls. This is, of course, a smaller model, but these 3-dimensional reefs are placed out in the bay at Maryland artificial reef sites. And they're built by students. And so a big part of the work I'm doing, and you may have seen in previous videos, is trying to build that sort of habitat, bottom habitat. Because after all, the striped bass is also called a rockfish here in Maryland. And, well, we call it a rockfish because it hangs around oyster rocks. And so ultimately, that's one example where fish connect to habitat. And at CCA, our mantra is habitat today equals fish tomorrow. That's what we're excited about, is really rolling up our sleeves to invest in habitat. And that's happening up and down our coasts. Our partners at CCA Texas just pledged $5 million in support of oyster restoration in Texas coastal bays in partnership with the Building Conservation Trust, CCA's National Habitat Program. And all of our different partners in the sport fishing and boating world continue to walk the walk and invest in habitat. And it's being done across sectors as well. There's tons of this work done. And so I'm happy Lenny has a great panel to talk about habitat. And if you're watching this later or live right now, I invite you to come out, if you're from the Annapolis area, and do that rolling up of your sleeves and build some reef balls with us at the U.S. Powerboat Show in Annapolis, October 5th through 8th. October 6th, Friday the 6th, will be Conservation Day. I'll be out there with some of our partners and volunteers. We'll have some seminars, and we invite you to come out and join us at the show. That day, Friday, if you're coming out, we have a buy one, get one free special with the boat show. So come on out to the fishing spot. You'll see Lenny and all the other folks out there having a great time and just getting together and talking about what we care about and also actually building reef balls at the boat show. So Lenny, I'll let you take it away before I talk too much. And I look forward to enjoying this great conversation you got teed up tonight.
Thank you, David. And I tell you what, I'm looking forward to the boat show too. I plan on helping to build some reef balls. I'm in.
I love it. I love it. Well, I will see you then. And I look forward to this conversation. So thank you.
Awesome. All right, folks. I'm Lenny Rudow. I'm the Angler-in-Chief of FishTalk magazine, a lifelong Chesapeake Bay angler, and your host for tonight, which is all about Chesapeake Bay habitat. Now, don't forget, people, we want to know what you want to know. So plug your questions right into the comments. Zach, our wizard behind the curtain, will field them. He'll get them up on screen, and we will get our panel of experts to give you some answers. Now, before we get started, we do need to thank our partners for making the Chesapeake Perspective series a reality. And I want everybody to remember, these are organizations and companies that stepped up to help support a recreational angling community here on the Chesapeake. So thank you, CCA Maryland, Yamaha Rightwooders, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, the American Sport Fishing Association, the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, Boat US, and the Marine Trades Association of Maryland. But most importantly, people, I want to thank you for taking your time here and now to tune in to become more involved and better educated about the bay that we all love so much. So, habitat? Heck, we're talking about the physical properties of the bay itself, which all those fish and critters live in. The submerged vegetation, the oyster bars, or lack thereof, the water quality, which basically boils down to kind of like the air we breathe. And I hope everyone remembers when the smoke blew down from Canada this year, when the wildfires clogged our air for days at a time. Remember that? Now, we all know that the bay's water is severely degraded. So just imagine if our air was like that all the time. Imagine if it was like that on a good day. Yeah, it would be difficult to survive, much less thrive. Still, it's hard for us to imagine what it's really like for those fish and crabs living in the conditions that we've created for them. Just how bad is it? Where and how can we improve it? We have a great panel of experts here with us tonight who will help us understand much better than we do now the habitat of the Chesapeake Bay, where it stands, and where it's going. Now, most of you, I'm sure, have heard about the critical role that submerged aquatic vegetation plays in the bay. And Brooke Landry is on board with us to expand our understanding of SAVs. Brooke is an SAV ecologist with the Maryland DNR and chairs the Chesapeake Bay program SAV work group. She runs the Chesapeake SAV Watchers Monitoring Program and the SAV Centennial Site Monitoring Program, and is a leader at the Chesapeake Bay Program SAV Management Strategy. Brooke, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, I told everybody we were going to waste no time. We're going to jump right into things tonight, and we'll start with a 1-minute lightning round. So in your own words, in 60 seconds or less, why are those underwater grasses an important part of the Chesapeake Bay habitat? Oh, we lost you, Brooke. I think we got you on mute. Zach, can we unmute? There we go.
How about now?
Now we got you.
I didn't do it. Sorry about that. Okay, so SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation. Their SAV beds are essentially little fish cities, fish towns and cities. They provide essential fish habitat. Fish, crabs, shellfish, even waterfowl they use SAV habitat in Chesapeake Bay and all of the tributaries. Besides providing habitat, SAV is essential in absorbing excess nutrients that come into the bay. That helps with water clarity. They're essential for climate change. They sequester carbon. They assist with reducing coastal acidification. They're great at reducing erosion because of that physical structure they're providing in the waterway. And, they're also they're beautiful to look at, which I think is something that's overlooked frequently. They're beautiful plants. They're vascular plants. There's a difference between seaweeds and SAV. But they do all sorts of good. And
awesome. Well, I got to say, I love the SAV in no small part, honestly, because it gives me a place to fish, right? There are fish swimming around in there. The only problem is sometimes it does get stuck on my hooks, but it's not the grass's fault. It's not the grass's fault.
It will wrap around a prop.
Right. Now, also with us tonight, people, we have Jen Sagan. Jen is an oyster restoration specialist from Friends of the Rappahannock. Friends of the Rappahannock is a nonprofit dedicated to the restoration of the Rappahannock River and its tributaries, which Jen joined after pursuing a degree in marine science and then returning to Virginia. Today, she is knee-deep in planning and implementing a variety of oyster restoration projects. Jen, thank you for being with us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
And you're up. Oysters are critters, but they also kind of create a part of the habitat, right? Just how important a role do they play?
Absolutely. And as I'm sure all of us I could talk about this for hours, but in essentially 4 quick points. Of course, they're a food source for tons of different animals as well as humans, and that supports our economy in numerous ways. They're word of the day. They're an important habitat for so many different critters in the area, and their reef structure that forms that habitat also helps to attenuate wave action. So they're helping with shoreline erosion as well by trying to break up some waves that are going towards eroding shorelines. And of course, one of their most characteristic traits is that they are constantly filtering the water and therefore taking pollutants out just by living. So super important critters.
Awesome. And they're quite tasty, I got to say.
Absolutely.
Just for the record. Our third panelist for the evening is Tom Parham. He is the Director of Tidewater Ecosystem Assessment at the Maryland DNR and has spent decades analyzing habitat and water quality since he got his degrees in biology and oceanography. He is also, and I really like this, people, a dedicated angler and a certified fly casting instructor. Tom, welcome. Uh-oh, Tom is muted. We got a mute button issue here, people. Exactly. There we go. Now
there we go. All right. Thanks, Lenny. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to say, so the water quality, from my 1-minute water quality, I would start with clean water is really life. I mean, obviously we're all 60% water. and everything around us, the way the water cycle works. When it rains, it comes on the land, runs off into the rivers, whether it evaporates over the water and off the land and circles around. What's so amazing about it is because it's so important, we have to be really careful about how we treat it. And so any kind of pollutants often can move through this whole cycle. And so when you think about the Chesapeake Bay, what we do on the land makes a big difference, in our water. So we want to make sure what we do on our lands has a clean Chesapeake Bay. And using a food analogy, if you look at, like a healthy bay, like a real tasty soup, if you have, if you have too much of one ingredient, too much algae, too much nutrients, the bay doesn't do so well. And if you have too much spice or too much of the wrong ingredient in your soup, the soup doesn't taste well. So right now, the bay doesn't taste well. So we want to work to make it taste better.
Boy, that is a really interesting way to look at it. I have never heard that before. Now, bringing you to the table is a great segue to bringing up our first slide. Zach, can we pop this up there? Because when we talk about habitat, we're talking about, like you said, land. And we're talking sea, and we're talking land under the sea. But let's start here with the land and development. And this slide, people, shows us impervious surfaces in the DC area. You can see there's quite a bit of it. And let's roll right over to slide 2, Zach, if we could. Because when you get out of the cities and you look at the shorelines, and this is on the South River right here. I took this picture a couple of years ago fishing with some friends. The shorelines are also developed. Maybe they're not paved, but they're developed. They're just not completely natural. And these issues combine, and let's go to slide number 3, Zach. I hate to see it, but we got to look at it, people. Boy. Now, Tom, I'm not a scientist, but that does not look to me like a picture of good water quality. Could you please explain to us what we're looking at here?
Sure. So I've seen this picture, and we posted it on Eyes on the Bay a while ago. And so this is April 4th, 2005. I've seen this so many times, and a lot of people use this. So what happened, this is early in the season, obviously April, and there was a lot of rain in the watershed. You can see it up at the top where the Susquehanna River comes in, and that's where 40 or 50% of the flow comes into the bay. And so what happens is when you have high flows or high rains on the watershed, it washes all nutrient and sediment into the rivers, and then when it comes down towards Conowingo, when you have high flows, what happens is you get scouring behind the dam, and you see this giant sediment plume coming down the bay. Just real quickly about the sediment plume is as the speed of the water slows down, a lot of the particles will settle out. So even though this looks like, even though you can see sediment plumes way down into, looks like close down to the Potomac River right there, the bulk of the sediment is stopping up in the upper part. The rest of it are fines that are coming down. It's not good. Fortunately it was April before underwater grasses are really up. This could have been like Agnes that happened in 72, where it happened in the middle of June when the underwater grasses were coming up and the bay is really coming alive, and you had sediment plumes going down the bay and fresh water almost near the mouth of the bay, causing lots of problems. But yeah, this isn't good. And this is part of it is, like you said, Lenny, what's happening on the land. We want to make sure the land's, taken care of, and we don't have a lot of sediments running off into the waters.
Now, you mentioned the SAV, so let's take this right over to Brooke. What kind of effect does this sort of event have on the SAVs?
It can be devastating, or it can be not a huge deal at all. When you've got a lot of sediment in the water, obviously, you have a condition called hydrobidity, and it clouds the water. It reduces the plant's ability to photosynthesize. So they're not creating energy, they're not growing. Eventually they might die if the water stays persistently muddy like this in this picture. A lot of times if it's just sediment, it settles out relatively quickly before the plants will die. But if there's a lot of wind action, it resuspends, it stays persistently muddy for weeks on end. You're going to see a loss of SAV. You might even see burial of SAV if there's just enough loose sediment in the water.
Tom, go for it. What do you think?
The other part about that is there's also lots of nutrients in there, and nutrients are food for algae. So even this is happening in April, what's this is doing is it's setting up the bay for lots of food for algae to grow later in the season, which can cause, when you have lots of algae blooms, it can cloud the water for underwater grasses. And when you have die-offs of algae blooms, as they settle and the bacteria decomposes them, it uses up lots of oxygen. So it's not a great way to start the season.
Yeah, much as I hate to say it, we're going to get into algae blooms tonight. Jen, what about oysters? What's going on with the oysters when all this stuff is coming down the bay?
Yeah, it's interesting because actually sediment specifically is our number one pollutant in the Rappahannock. So it's something we very actively deal with anyway. But for poor water quality in general, it mainly is a factor of production. Really unhealthy water will decrease oyster production, and it could eventually smother them, especially at their most fragile states when they're teeny tiny baby larvae or oyster spat. The water turbidity from sediment and such is usually more of an indicator for us, because we actually use the seagrasses that Brooke is talking about as an indicator for a successful environment that we've been restoring. So if we have really turbid water, our mindset is usually, okay, we need to do what we can on the land, but also this means that our oyster restoration is not quite up to par here. We want to get the water nice and healthy and clean enough that those grasses can come back. So that's kind of one of our current goals when it comes to water quality.
Now, Jen, you said something that's going to make me go off script here. I'm sorry, people. We're going off script. Can't help it. So what about, we've heard this argument. We've all heard this argument before where people say, well, the oysters just get smothered by this anyway, so we might as well just harvest them before they get smothered. Is that a reality? What's your response?
They're resilient creatures. They are. I know my whole job is restoring them, but their most fragile state is when they're young. And once we get them to that healthy age where they are mature and can start reproducing, that's generally when they're good. Like, yeah, we can't go out and put adult oysters into a really muddy bottom of a river because they'll get smothered vertically that way by sinking down into it and not able to filter and breathe. But it's generally not, okay, sediment is coming off the land, it's going to smother all the adult oysters. That's typically not how that happens. It's not as big of an effect that it would take to kill them.
That's really interesting because I've heard that a bunch of times. But you mentioned something else I gotta get on to. I gotta ask you about too, and that was it. This was a big problem in the Rap, and those of us who live where I do, up near Annapolis, Baltimore, D.C., we commonly think of the northern areas as being the really developed areas, the areas where this is really a problem. The Rappahannock, I mean, my gosh, there's not nearly the level of development. Is there? Why is there still this problem?
There's not, but we do have Fredericksburg right at our fall line. There is also a lot of homeowner land use. That's a lot of our projects is working with individual landowners who will convince to convert old farmland to wetlands or do tree plantings or living shorelines. It is in a way almost more tough because it's communicating with a lot of individuals and trying to spread this message and education about these problems. Whereas sometimes in our cities, even though they're smaller ones, it is a totally different game because that is our more urban setting, and spreading the word about this style of restoration work may be a little easier to communicate than it is to homeowners who have been living in their area for however many years and frankly may be a little set in their ways.
Interesting. But this isn't the only problem, is it? Zach, why don't you go ahead and pop up slide number 4. I dread this one. There's your algae, Tom. It's a great picture. That's a horrible picture, right? It's
It
just
is.
miserable to look at. And for those of us who don't live in areas where we regularly see blooms, because where I do here on the South, we see blooms virtually every year. This year's actually been really mild. This has been a really good year for it, but we see it on a very regular basis. For those who aren't familiar with these blooms, please tell us what we're looking at here.
So that, I believe, is down in Virginia, and that's a very nasty bloom. And some of the different types of algae. Remember, we're kind of talking about a soup where we have too much spice. Well, here's a perfect example of it. And when you have too many nutrients coming down, like that picture you showed earlier, Lenny, where you have the sediment coming down that's loaded with nutrients. When you have lots of food, it's fuel for lots of these algae blooms. And again, this is a big problem. There's certain types of algae that are actually toxic for bay life. And one of the things that we're really trying to do is reduce the food for algae so we don't see as much of these things right here. So that's a nasty bloom, and we've been seeing quite a few of those this year. Lenny, one of the reasons why we don't see that many is we had a real dry spring, and we've started to get more rains. I know we're going to have rains this weekend, but when we have a lot of those spring rains, typically you'll start seeing throughout the year, you'll see more incidents of lots of these blooms.
Now, I'm kind of going off script again, but I really want to ask Brooke. You mentioned earlier about how I think it was the clarity could be affected by the bloom, and that could affect the SAV.
Yeah.
But this is an over nutrification problem, right?
Yep.
So wouldn't it kind of make sense that the SAV would like that?
Well, SAV definitely needs some level of nutrients, but they absorb phosphorus, nitrogen. They use it to build their plant tissue, but like anything else, like the soup analogy that Tom's using, too much is just too much. And so, when you have a nice, big, healthy grass bed, it'll absorb a decent amount of that over nutrients or oversupply of nutrients, but they can only take in so much. So, it's self-regulating to an extent, but not.
Something I've noticed is that on the western shore, where we get a lot of blooms, where the water's honestly, pretty bad in these developed areas, we do see the early spring grass, which I think is the eelgrass. Is that right?
No.
It's the other way around. I got it backwards.
Around here in Annapolis and like the Severn and South, we see horned pondweed. That's Xanachelia. Yeah.
And that's what dies off early, right?
It does. Yeah.
And eelgrass is what we would like, but don't have. Is that accurate?
Well, eelgrass is a marine species it's in the southern portion of the bay where it's saltier. So we wouldn't see eelgrass in the mid bay where we are.
Well, why does all our grass die by June or by the end of June?
It doesn't. We have quite a lot of grass in the Severn and Eastern Bay, or same area to the east. We've got a lot of grass around here.
That's interesting. Where I keep my boats in Ramsey Lake, in the beginning of June, there's a ton of grass, and by the end of June, it's all gone. Doesn't make sense, huh?
For one of the things, in my old career, I used to do a little bit of SAV work, and one of the things we found is this horned pondweed that Brooke is talking about. Usually, it dies off around June, and so that's what you're seeing. And we would get calls from citizens saying, what's going on? All the grass is dying. It's just part of its natural cycle. And like Brooke said, there's lots of different species that instead of dying off in June, they're just coming on strong. So they peak, in July, August, time like that. So that's what you're seeing, the horned pondweed dying off.
Okay. Well, let's connect some dots here, people. How does all this affect, how does it tie into, say, rockfish, crabs? Out to the panel, whoever wants to address it.
Habitat. Habitat and oxygen. So crabs use SAV Rockfish use SAV. They need that habitat. They hunt in the grass beds. They hide in the grass beds. If you don't have that protection, their cities, they're open for predators. They can't find enough food. Any number of issues arise when they just don't have anywhere to live besides just a barren mudflat.
Okay. Well, Jen, oysters are kind of natural combatants against poor water quality, right? Because they filter the water, right?
Mhm.
So how come they can't keep up?
So for that, you kind of need a general understanding of a timeline of oysters. For a big speed run of that, we used to have massive, massive populations of oysters. There's records of during the colonial eras that their ships coming over to the United States would run aground on oyster reefs because they were built up so much, and individual oysters were the size of dinner plates. So it's all these stories of really massive, healthy oysters and oyster reefs. And of course, that's changed a lot now. And that was a few things. First, that colonial era kind of kicked it off with using oysters as this lifeline. They essentially saved the Jamestown colony. They've almost fully relied on them for food and then started using them for construction, among other things. And that rolled into a long time later, having the Industrial Revolution, and this obsession with oysters continued. They were able to start canning them, start shipping them really far. And of course, we ended up over-harvesting them. And we still have our oysters today, but it's only at about 1% of the population that used to be in the bay. So very, very small numbers. On top of that, around the 70s, 80s, the diseases MSX and dermo came about. And all you really need to know about that is they were hitting the oysters even more. More and more oysters were dying off because of these diseases. Since then, through some genetic modification, I don't like saying that because it has a negative connotation a lot of the times, but as well as selective breeding, we are able to now have oysters that do pretty well against those diseases. And of course, we have a lot of oyster restoration now. But long story short, with development and the die-off of oysters over time, they aren't able to as effectively filter the water as they may have been previously. And again, that all comes back to water quality and taking away from the habitat.
So follow-up question, you mentioned a statistic, which I've heard many times before, which is that there's about 1% of the historical population of oysters left in the Chesapeake, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that being the case, clearly we have ceased taking them out of the water, right? We don't commercially harvest them anymore, do we?
There are now more effective regulations in place.
I'm
And
being facetious, Jeff.
and I was going to make a little push for oyster farming, which is actually a very sustainable method of eating oysters.
It absolutely is. And there is a lot of oyster farming going on. They've made great strides. I think they hit that 1 billion mark they were shooting for already, right? Which was ahead of schedule.
Yes.
But it does honestly just boggle my mind that when there's 1% left, we don't stop taking it. That is just really spectacularly crazy.
As
But
long
okay.
as we can do it responsibly.
Oh, well, let's talk about some of the things that are being done right now to try and improve habitat. Zach, can we flip on over to slide number 6 here? And what we're going to see, oh, wait a minute. So we skipped over this one. I apologize, because the dead zone never came up. But Tom, I'm gonna back up a minute, and let's just take us from the algae blooms to the dead zones, please.
Sure. So when we get a lot of nutrients flushing in the bay, like that first picture you showed, Lenny, that is food for algae. And when we have lots of food, we have lots of algae. And algae are like plants, and during the day when they grow, they produce oxygen, and at night they consume oxygen. So when you have a large algae bloom at night, it can take up a lot of oxygen that's needed for other organisms, including, for all your listeners here, rockfish and all the other things they like to fish for. In addition, when these blooms start to die off, and it can be a matter of days or maybe even a week, as they settle to the bottom and decompose, they use up even more oxygen. So for your bay fish or your bay organisms, the low levels of oxygen when you have these algal blooms, what happens is for like some of your cool water species, when during the summertime when they're trying to get away from the warm water and go a little bit deeper to get to cool water, they run into these layers where there's very low or no oxygen at all. So when you have these algae blooms, it can cause more areas where you have low oxygen. I just got calls today from some watermen that are up along Pools Island, and they had their crab pots out, and they were they're running into very, very low oxygen down like to 15 to 10 feet. And so when we have these algae blooms, it impacts a lot of different critters. And Lenny, you were talking also about the Western shore. Lots of times you'll get blooms that'll start on the Western shore, and the winds will slowly move them across the bay. And as they move across the bay, they start to settle and die. And you can almost predict when I'll start getting calls from crabbers along the eastern shore saying, my crabs are dying in the pots, because as that slug of low oxygen starts moving across the bay and running into those shallows there. So it's not good. So more algae is going to be more oxygen problems, and more oxygen problems impacts fish, crabs, and oysters, everything in the bay. So not good.
Well, thank you for the explanation. I hated even having to put that slide up. The dead zone is just not an awesome thing.
Real quickly, let me just say, so this year when we were talking about in the springtime, we had less flows than normal. Because of that, we have less nutrients coming in the bay. And so this year we've had, the prediction was we'd have a much better oxygen conditions in the bay. And that's actually what we're seeing. So less nutrients, better oxygen conditions in the bay.
Yeah. And I gotta tell you, Tom, as an angler, I've noticed through the years, when it doesn't rain and we have a drought, the water cleans up. When it rains, it goes to heck again. But of course we can't control the rainfall. So we got to attack the root of this problem before the rain ever comes, which is a great segue to go right on to the next slide and talk about what's being done right now. Now, what you see here, people, are reef balls. This is a picture from a CCA Maryland building event. They're made from concrete. They're poured into molds. They pop the molds. They call it hatching the reef balls. Go to the next one, if you would, please, Zach. And now these reef balls, Jen, why don't you tell us what's going on with these reef balls? Because I'm sure looking at this picture, you probably know, right?
Yeah, I was actually at a CCA event yesterday building these with a school group. So
nice.
Very fresh. These are pretty awesome. So it's a simple enough concept that you can build it with, I think these were 6th and 7th graders, with the right guidance, instructions, and materials, which you all provided. And they're great. It's essentially kickstarting an oyster reef. It's providing that nice 3-dimensional structure you can see in the photos there. It has the holes in it for nice water flow going through, and hopefully would allow for grasses to grow as well. And still is a nice habitat structure that little fish, shrimp, whatever can go in and out of, and hopefully encourage oysters to land on those reef balls as well, since it is that nice hard concrete textured structure that they should like to land on in the appropriate areas. So very cool, very effective project.
And what we've got in the tank in the foreground here is they can be seeded with spat, right? They can be put in a tank with water circulating with spat that will land on those balls and then dropped off into the water, and there will be oysters growing on them. Now, we had a question about instructions for building reef balls. which honestly might be a little much to get into at this moment. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Dave Sikorsky, I know he's watching, if he will please go into the comments and give some direction here, because nobody knows more about building these things than David does. So stay tuned on that. We'll get you the answer there. It might just take a minute here. And then we have another one popping in. When it comes to restoring reef, has anyone considered seeding the riprap that surrounds Poplar Island? Boy, that's a fascinating idea. One has to wonder, with all that riprap, why some oysters haven't just naturally attached in the first place. But that is a heck of a good idea. I've never heard it brought up before. Does anyone on the panel have any insight on that? Would it work on riprap?
So oysters do naturally settle on riprap, as I'm sure this person may have seen already. And the only way, I think the most efficient way to tackle that would be having the surrounding area start to build a culture of oysters. So, for example, we have a creek that we work in down near me, and it's in partnership with the Tides In, a group that supports oyster restoration in our area. And one thing we encourage is homeowners all starting to do oyster gardening off their docks. And that's when they reproduce, that's kind of putting out a lot of oyster larvae into the water in different areas. And with something like that, hopefully it might naturally occur on that riprap. I don't necessarily think that seeding it would be the most efficient way, because if they're not naturally occurring there, maybe it wouldn't be a suitable place for them anyway. I'm not super familiar with that area that you're referring to, though.
Well, honestly, what it is a dredge containment facility where they rebuilt an island by, ringing it with riprap, and then they put the dredge in, drain the water out, and you end up with a big riprap donut, which absolutely is some pretty fantastic habitat for an awful lot of fish. I mean, you catch rockfish there, speckled sea trout, crabs are all going through the rocks. It is good habitat, and we do have to figure out something to do with all that dredge material. So it's a pretty decent project. But man, the thought of those rocks being lined with oysters, that just gets me downright excited. Zach, why don't you take us to the next slide? Let's look at the next stage of the process here. And we got Kevin chiming in. Kevin's asking, do any of the panelists see value in studying the impact of the menhaden harvest on water quality in the bay? Whoa, that's a big question. Does anybody want to address that? Oh man, that is a toughie. It's an issue that I have heard come up before with other folks who point out the fact that the menhaden is, like the oyster, a filter feeder. So if we're sucking X number of metric tons out a year, we're removing the capacity to filter X gallons a year of the Chesapeake's waters. And I don't know what those numbers are. They're way beyond me. But that's a valid question. That's a very interesting point. Kevin, I'm gonna try and think of somebody I can direct that question to. I don't know who would have the answer to that. That's a toughie. Oh, John Page is chiming in. Hi, John Page. And saying, remember the lower bay with a higher salinity has a much more natural spat fall than the upper bay. So maybe that process, which you were talking about, Jen, just gets triggered a little easier there. I know that in the upper bay, I've always wondered, like, you go to other places and the bridge pilings have oysters on them. I've always wondered why the Bay Bridge never has had oysters on it. Like, you would think they would land on the pilings, but for whatever reason they don't. But the riprap poplar is another great example. There are many like that. And it does seem to me that it's kind of true. When the farther south you go, the more you see the oysters on stuff. Zach, Toby's chiming in. How about the shell going out of state as there's no processing capability in Maryland and tax on outgoing shell? Is Maryland getting enough shell back to replenish oyster bars? I can address that one, Toby, because I recently saw a press release from the governor. The governor signed a directive, and I believe the new secretary of the DNR was addressing this issue, and they have committed to finding ways to make sure that there's a constant supply of new shell. And And I'm not sure the details. Does anybody here know the details of that? Nope. All right. Then we're going to move on. But Toby, if you Google it, there was a recent announcement. The governor did make a hard promise on that one to make sure that we had enough shell around here. Of course, in the past, it's been dredged up, which leads to all kinds of other problems. It's led to sort of put and take oyster fishery, which has led to all kinds of other problems. So that's a big issue. Big issue. All right, what happens to these oyster balls once they get yanked out of that tank covered in spat? Zach, take us on to the next slide here, please. Hey, here it is. I love this picture. This is a great picture. This is reef balls going out into the water. It just, it doesn't get much better than that. And Zach, just roll right over the next slide, please, because we're going to see what happens when these things are underwater. Oh, so we got spat's a timing issue. Typically, all right, so that makes sense. And you do see plenty of barnacles on the rocks. So maybe that explains it. So here we go. Here we have a brand new condominium for fish, for crabs, for grass shrimp, for ghost anemones, for just about every kind of critter that you can think of. And you know what? I'm going to put a quick pause on the conversation here to make a pitch, people. Because if you love the Bay and you are not a member of CCA Maryland, I want you to take a look in the mirror right now and ask yourself why. I mean, come on. For the cost of a couple bags of bloodworms, for a heck of a lot less than filling the fuel tank in your boat, you could be helping CCA make more of this. You could be helping them restore the habitat in the Bay. And guess what? As a result, you're going to catch more fish. Now, I fished the Tillman Reef right off Tillman Island at least, 4 or 5 times this year. These reef balls are everywhere. There's oysters growing on the bottom there. I've got rockfish, black sea bass, speckled trout. There is all kinds of stuff swimming around there. So you know what? You join CCA, you help them build these reef balls. You're doing yourself a favor. Now, I know you're watching this right now, but I know you know enough to open another tab on your computer and go to ccamd.org. It's as simple as that. ccamd.org. Join, please. By the way, you feel a whole lot better about yourself. Now, I'm going to tell you, on the last episode of Live with Lenny, I made the same pitch, and we got 5 new members. You want to make me feel good? I want 6 new members tonight. Come on, people. I know we can do it. You can help right now. ccamd.org. All right. Now, I'll get off my soapbox. I want to ask Jen, how important is it that Dave's asking about the oyster toads in the reef? There's oyster toads around them too. And John Page is chiming in on CBF. He's absolutely right. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation are natural partners. There's really, look, if you can afford a boat to go fishing on the Chesapeake Bay, you got no excuse to not belong to both. Like, truly, you got none. All right, let's take it to Jen again. How important is it that we humans do projects like this?
So, of course, I'm biased, and it's incredibly important. And I'm one of those people that likes to still believe that every effort counts. But also what we're doing right now, the outreach, the education of the public is almost equally important. We want people to understand what is happening, why it's happening, and maybe the little habits in your everyday life that you could change, your land management practices, etc., just that end up ultimately going into the water and affecting everything we're talking about today. So yes,
we're definitely going to touch on that too.
Oops.
We're going to touch on that one.
Yeah. So ultimately, I love the hands-on reef ball stuff and everything. It's great. It's super effective, but that everything else is equally important as well.
Now, I'm wondering, Brooke, does this tie into the SAVs when you have, say, a creek, let's say that just happens to be located off the Chop Tank River, and you have a big oyster restoration project like this? Is there a relationship with the SAVs that you see as a result?
Well, yeah, I think definitely. The more oysters there are around, the more they're filtering the water. And, improved water clarity leads to more SAV. As long as there's a seed source for SAV somewhere nearby, if the water clears up, the grasses will come back, or they'll become more abundant in an area. So oysters and SAV are definitely a natural, they're friends. They're definitely friends.
Now, what pops into my head constantly when we're talking about this is the Harris Creek Restoration Project, where there are tons of oysters, and it is the only place in the state of Maryland where I've ever gone and sight fished for striped bass, because the water in there is so darn clear, and the SAV, they're just these broad beds, and you can literally sight fish for rockfish, which honestly, for many years, I never thought, was even a possibility. But on that bright note, we're going to turn to a slightly darker note, because while we're dealing with these battles with development, runoff, loss of habitat, and we're trying to rebuild this habitat, we're also dealing with this whole climate change thing. Zach, you want to bring up slide number 10? Now, we certainly have some odd species showing up in the bay these days. Fish we didn't really see a whole bunch of in the past. You can go ahead and pop the next one up, Zach. This one, the cutlass fish were just crazy this year. They were all the way up north into the Middle Bay zone in huge numbers. This is a couple of years ago in the Tangier Sound. Now, the Tangier is pretty far south from Maryland, but that's a ladyfish. What is that thing doing in Maryland? And you know what? In this week's FishTalk Fishing Reports, we have a photograph of a gag grouper, which was one of 2 caught near Cape Charles. There's just a whole lot of wacky stuff going on. We can blame it on whatever we want to blame on, but there's just a lot of weird things going on. And I'm wondering, let's start with Brooke. Climate change. How is that going to affect SAV? Do we have a clue how it might affect SAV? What are we worried about?
Yeah, we've got a pretty good idea for most of our species, or some of our species. So the plant that I mentioned earlier, eelgrass, which is down in the southern portion of the bay, it's a cold water plant. It does not like to be very hot. So we have, because of water quality, but now also because of warming temperatures, we've seen a huge loss of eelgrass in the lower portion of the bay. We see, there are years where, this year was a great year for eelgrass. But overall, it's like oysters, we are down to a really low percent of the original, acreage of eelgrass in the lower portion of the bay. The other plants, the plants that we have in the mid-bay and the upper bay, the mesohaline and freshwater species like widgeon grass and wild celery, they do not seem to be as heavily impacted by warming temperatures. It's probably messing with their germination and timing to a certain extent, but they don't just, die off like eelgrass does, fortunately. So that's really good. The other aspect to SAV and climate change is that when the plants in the water photosynthesize, they're releasing oxygen, and that actually really helps with, it helps reduce coastal acidification. And it's another great relationship that we see with oysters and clams and mussels, is that, those shellfish creatures, anything that's creating a calcium carbonate shell, is heavily impacted, or can be heavily impacted, especially the larvae and the babies. They're heavily impacted by acidification. So when you have more grass, it helps buffer and neutralize those acidic conditions. So very important to keep grasses around into the future for sure.
So John Page is saying we should ask about the Severn's. I don't have my glasses, John Page. I can't quite read that. Asquith Reef and the huge grass bed beside it?
Yeah, so there's a really large oyster restoration project going on in the Severn River. And maybe because of it, maybe just because the Severn's in decent shape, there's a lot of grass in the Severn River. We've got a lot of sago pondweed and widgeon grass, and in the Round Bay area, primarily of the Severn River, right now, I think there's about 200, 300 acres of grass, and it's lovely habitat. And I live on the Severn, and I've been hearing all summer about the amazing crabbing that has been happening.
Now, Fred's asking, and this is out to the whole crew here, why can't mankind add some kind of sort of filtration system?
Funding.
Kind of a toughie to tackle. Who wants to try and tackle that one?
Yeah.
I'll take it. Go ahead, Brooke. Do you want to say something?
No, you go.
Okay. So that's a great question. When we hear that periodically, how do we, clean up the waters? One of the things about adding filtration, what we want to do is, instead of just adding filtration, we want to take care of the problem. So it's not a band-aid. What we want to do is make sure there's less food or the nutrients that are coming into the water. The system itself, Mother Nature knows what she's doing. And so if we can reduce the nutrients coming in, we'll get clearer waters, more oxygen. We've seen that again and again. Research has shown that. So that's the best way to do that, is reduce the nutrients going in. And then natural filters, whether it's underwater grasses, whether it's the algae growing on the bottom, oysters, or the filter fish. There's a lot of different ways, but we just have to reduce the excess nutrients, and we'll be much better off.
No disagreement for me. Although I will note that in a way we already do filtration, right? We have drainage ditches. We have the Conowingo Dam, which was effective, except now we can't change the filter. It's kind of like when the filter in your sink turns orange and gross, but you can't get it out to switch it. It's sort of the state that we're stuck at up there. But I got to admit to Fred, it's gone through my head a million times. Well, it would be great if we could just put like a big gauze pad at the mouth of every creek.
Well, we kind of try that. I mean, that slide you showed earlier with all the impervious surface. So what happens is, when it rains, instead of the water slowly seeping into the ground or slowly coming off into our waters, what happens is it runs off very quickly. And when it goes off very quickly, it takes what's on the land, and that water, when it hits the pavement, it warms up. So you have warm water that's got lots of nutrients going in. So there's lots of efforts, whether it's, cover crops, or whether it's shoreline buffers. There's lots of things we try to do. But the bottom line is, like you're saying earlier, impervious surfaces are tough. But if we can find ways to reduce the nutrients going in, that's ultimately our best solution.
All right. Well, let's I want you to keep going, Tom, but I want you to take us on to climate change. Are you seeing effects at this point that you can point to and say, oh boy, this is a climate change issue in water quality?
Yes. And for a lot of folks, they'll say, why does climate change, how does that impact the bay? So think about your can of Coke sitting on your desk, or your soft drink. If that can of Coke was warmer, it holds, when you open it up, it goes fizzing out. Well, the water itself, when it's warmer, can hold less oxygen. So one of the things is it makes it harder to hold oxygen, so it's tougher for organisms. And for us trying to clean up the bay, we have to work harder. It's more expensive to get those oxygen levels in there. And then for all the organisms that are, that need oxygen, it's really tough. So with, excess nutrients causing issues with oxygen and warming temperatures, it's kind of a double whammy for a lot of these species. We've been doing, I've been fortunate to work with amazing people in DNR. Brooke is one of them. But some folks that out of fisheries, and also Jim Uphoff was one of your guests earlier, and Andrew Keppel and Renee Carr. And we looked at how is climate change impacting striped bass? Because being a fisherman, I always want to know, how are things changing? Lenny, you had an article that came out a couple years ago in your great FishTalk magazine, where you talked about, hey, the bay is changing. The bay that we used to have is not the bay we have now, and it's not going to be the bay down the road. And folks like you and I who are older, we remember what the bay was like. But folks that are just getting on the water now, starting to fish, that's kind of their, that's their baseline right now. But things have really, really changed. And so we looked at rockfish. We said, okay, for the resident fish that live in the bay, in this, in the that are here all year round, and they're the ones that make up the bulk of the recreational and commercial fisheries. How are the conditions for those folks, or not folks, excuse me, for those fish? And so what we did is working through the literature, looking through our monitoring data, scouring all sorts of papers, we found that we found that when you can come up with a series of thresholds for those fish. And what we found is, there are temperature and dissolved oxygen thresholds. And when we started looking at the bay from when we started our monitoring, we can see over time what's happened is oxygen wise, we're kind of staying the same, which is amazing because there's been more people living in the watershed and, all those impacts. But the dominant impact is the water temperature. And so for rockfish, which are relatively cool water species, in the summertime, when we have peak temperatures, which are typically in July, you're going to have, when you combine that with low oxygen that typically happens at that time of year, it puts a lot of stress on those fish. And we know from climate change, from our long-term monitoring using these new thresholds we put together, we can see probably right around 2010, somewhere around there, a little earlier, a little later, what we're seeing is evidence of longer periods, more severe periods, and more frequent periods of poor habitat for rockfish. So we had there'll be a plug for our some of the work that Maryland Fisheries Department and Fishing and Boating Service and Resource Assessment did together. But we put this information together, and we also include it in the fishing report. I'm actually a co-writer for the Maryland Fishing Report. And my part is I put in the bay conditions every week. So I'm always looking at what's going on in the bay and trying to use monitoring information to help people catch more fish. Because I know, the bay's an amazing place. I love fishing there, but I know that it's hard to care about something if you don't understand it and if you're not out there. There's a quote, Lenny, I said, I forwarded to you. There's an angler that just passed away, a guy named Lefty Cray, and he had a super cool quote. It says, "The more people we can get out there to fish, the better the world will be. Because if they aren't out there, they don't care." And so the purpose of the monitoring information we do on Eyes on the Bay and Click Before You Cast is to get people to understand, what's going on in the bay, why things are changing, to get them involved, to understand, so they can become more active, advocates for the bay. So in this tool we just did for striped bass is so people can see that, things are changing. It impacts the things they care most about.
So that is hilarious because this was not a setup, people. I had no idea. I read that every week. I always read it. I had no idea that you were the guy who put that together.
So Keith Lockwood is the one who puts. Yeah, Keith Lockwood does an amazing job putting all the fish stuff. But I have the bay conditions again, and so the whole thing is help people understand the changing bay and how it relates to helping them catch fish.
Now, here's a really interesting question coming in from Mike Billings. What are some positive impacts of a warming climate to the area? How would it compare to Carolina bays, for instance? That's a fascinating question. Do we see any positive impacts on the grasses, the oysters, the water quality? What do we got?
Well,
I can answer that. Go ahead, Brooke.
So just quickly, with the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, it actually acts like a fertilizer for plants. So there's what we call a CO2 fertilization effect. So it doesn't necessarily, bolster them enough to deal with the other stressors associated with climate change, but they are more, more active with the increased CO2. So that's one benefit. One small benefit. Yeah.
So
add to that, Tom?
Yeah. So I guess you can look at this however you want, because we have a warming bay. I think some of you may have seen, they had an article, I think it was in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they looked at how the climate was changing in the United States. And they said, I think by 2100, I think Annapolis or Washington, D.C. is going to have the same climate of some place in Mississippi, which is usually sweltering hot. So, you can tell things are going to be changing. And so the bay changes too. So some of these warming conditions have caused winners of species that like warmer conditions. And now they have, and again, I'll let you take this whether you support it or not. But there's now they're working on these a shrimp fishery in the Chesapeake Bay, which is kind of crazy. So,
it is kind of crazy.
I certainly like shrimp, but it's not the same bay.
And just so folks out there know, we're not talking about grass shrimp. These are the white shrimp. They're real actual shrimp that have come up. Virginia did a experimental fishery. I think they started 3 years ago, might have been 4, and caught hundreds of thousands of pounds. And the next thing you know, these shrimp are showing up in the Tangier Sound. Oh, by the way, we've had a great year for red drum. We got speckled trout all over the place. Cutlass fish are all over the place. I mean, it is pretty crazy. And clearly, like they always say with climate change, there are winners and there are losers. That's interesting. John Page talking about the baby black grouper in the grass beds. And and we had a new record for pompano in the Tangier Sound this week. Sheep's head have been all over the place, clear up to the target ship. What's fascinating is, if you go back in the historical record, I remember doing archaeology at St. Mary's College, and you would find piles of sheep's head teeth from the sheep's head caught in the St. Mary's River back in the 1600s, which of course today you wouldn't think you got them. But guess what? Now they're up at the target ships. That's a stone's throw. So it is terrifically interesting. But we did not get to ask Jen yet about climate change and oysters. Do we know of any of the effects of climate change as they apply to oysters in specific?
When you're speaking about temperature, first of all, the main thing is that it affects their reproduction. I know this may be semi-common knowledge, but oysters tend to start reproducing when the water hits like around 70 degrees or so. And I mean, we have a spout on shell operation with the tides in, and, we kind of like having that warm water so that we can do our spout on shell operation. But of course, with the natural reproduction of oysters, you don't want to throw that cycle off either. And that's just one factor. Brooke also mentioned, of course, the ocean acidification aspect. And with oysters, like I said, they're pretty hardy creatures, luckily. But when they're I've mentioned a few times now, those really fragile stages, when they're a larvae, it can affect them. When they're a spat trying to form its shell on a new shell or alternate substrate like the reef balls, it can affect that. So there's definitely multiple negatives working against them with that. Okay,
interesting. Well, we mentioned earlier, I think it might even been you, Jen. Somebody mentioned kind of the Joe homeowner effect, right? Of what we're all doing in our own backyards and how it affects all this stuff. We've talked about CCA, CBF, restoring habitat. I would like everybody, and let's go in a circle. We'll start with Brooke. Just give some backyard advice to folks. What would your backyard advice be, so that to me, so that I can be a better homeowner in the bay and have less of an impact on the bay habitat, less of a negative impact on the bay habitat, on the SAVs? What do you say?
So I will address waterfront homeowners specifically. So folks that actually might have,
me, but okay.
Me either. But folks that live on the water, they can have a huge impact on the grass beds that are directly adjacent to their shoreline, their property. What we ask folks to do is, for one, don't remove the grass. Like, you are allowed to, for navigable purposes, if you have a dock, you can, if you're kind of locked in by the grass and you need to get out to a navigable channel, like it is in the Maryland Code of Regulations, that you can remove just enough to get out there. We ask that you just slow down, put your prop up, deal with the grass, accept it, embrace it. Don't do anything to get rid of it. Second, if you need to do something about erosion control on your shoreline, we ask first that you just leave it natural. The natural shoreline is best for SAV. But, if you can avoid it, don't put in riprap. Obviously, don't put in a bulkhead. Those things aren't great for SAV. don't fertilize your lawn. There's so much excess fertilizer and excess nutrients going in the bay because, of this like need for a nice, pretty green lawn. If you can hold off, just don't fertilize your lawn because it all just winds up in the water and it creates, algae blooms and that shades out the grasses. So, there are so many things you can do. If you're constructing a dock, you can buy materials, you can use materials or use construction methods that reduce the amount of shading the dock produces. So, if you put a dock over grass, you might shade it out, but you can do particular, like specific construction methods. You can use graded decking that doesn't shade out the grasses. So there are lots of things that waterfront property owners can do to help promote SAV, habitat. So
Okay, good stuff. Good stuff. Jen, what do you think? What do you tell the homeowner?
I mean, that was a great synopsis of a lot of awesome things right there. And of course, that's not only helping SAV, that's helping water quality, oysters, everything. And I mean, all of those things are so helpful. Again, really thinking about your lawn is one thing that anyone can do, not just waterfront homeowners. I think earlier when we talked about sedimentation, we talked about agriculture and farming a bit. I mean, there's different regulations for that, whether it's fencing your cattle, doing, like I mentioned, maybe tree plantings if you have the ability to. Brooke mentioned the living shorelines. That's always great. It doesn't always have to be these huge action projects, though. It can just be being mindful of those everyday things and thinking about what is running off from your property towards the waterway that you live closest to. So
okay, cool. Tom, what you got?
So I'm going to say two things if that doesn't ruin it. The first thing is get out there and enjoy our waterways, because it's amazing for folks that haven't spent time, on the bay, enjoy your nearby creeks, rivers, and streams, because there's a lot of wonderful things. Once you see how amazing they are, it's easier to care about them and then also get involved. That's the big thing. Get involved. There's lots of organizations out there that once you care about it and you get involved, they can help marshal the forces together to make changes all across the board. And these groups can also, help us, put pressure on our elected officials to make the tough changes we need in order to protect what's good, but also, to try to restore what needs help. So that's a big thing is enjoy and become involved.
God, I love it.
Can I add one more thing? Can I just say,
Please, go for it.
Plant trees. Plant trees. Don't take your trees down, plant more trees. That's vital to the entire watershed.
Okay. I got to say, it just, Tom, what you were talking about, what always goes through my head is the stronger the fishing community is, the better it is for all of us. And people complain about overcrowding on the water, and that's always an issue. But if people aren't out there enjoying it, seeing what it is, they don't care. They don't, and they don't get involved. And we know what happens next. So we're going to move on to another question in 1 second. But first, okay, we got a question coming in. So Herb's talking about inspecting and or upgrading your septic system. So that's interesting, because we're probably going to have a very different viewpoint on septic systems depending on where we are, right? It's going to be very different on the Northern Neck than it is in Baltimore City. But that's a great point, that particularly for folks who have their own septic systems at their own homesteads, you want to make sure that that's on the up and up.
Yep.
Kevin's got a question for you, Brooke. He has a waterfront property that is a bulkhead from 30 years ago. Any suggestions on ways to add native plants that would make my bulkhead a more living one? Boy, what a great question.
That's tricky. I would say if you can convert it to a living shoreline, that would be great. I know that's out of the realm of possibility for some folks, but anything you can do to get rid of that vertical, that hard vertical structure, it messes with the wave energy. It eliminates, you get this backwash. It eliminates the shallow water habitat for grasses. SAV, sometimes you can get SAV, and if you've got a nice like quiet cove with a bulkhead, you might still have SAV, but that excess energy, you lose it. But aside from actually just taking it out and converting it to a living shoreline, you could plant native marsh grasses maybe behind it, something along those lines, but I'm not really sure, besides something more drastic.
So there's we don't have a method of taking a bulkhead and making it more eco-friendly? That doesn't exist, or is it we don't have that?
Not that I really know of, not without major structural change. Anything that you can do on your yard side of the bulkhead, planting trees, putting in marsh grasses, anything that'll improve, anything that'll reduce runoff from your yard into the waterway will help.
That bums me out that we don't have a way to deal with that, because as we saw in that picture we put up at the very beginning, man, bulkhead, like around here, there's not much shoreline that's not bulkhead. Like the majority of it is bulkhead.
Yeah. That's not great.
No, it seems like it would be awesome if we had a way, I don't know, some way to make that, a more eco-friendly kind of situation there.
Yeah. A lot of people do convert to living shorelines, but do you have suggestions, Tom? I think you're raising your hand.
So one thing you might be able to do is at DNR, there's a group called the Critical Area Commission, and they look at development within the first 1,000 feet of shorelines. And I would bet if you contact those folks, they could steer you in the right direction to build on what Brooke was saying. Here's the folks that can help you out to create a better shoreline habitat.
Interesting. Okay. Well, what other forms of habitat restoration are taking place on the bay? And I'll just put this out there to whoever wants to grab a hold of it. What is the government helping with this? The state, the feds? Please.
So the governor signed a new executive order in June or July, I can't remember when it was. And what they are trying to do is, they know that through our efforts through bay restoration, some things are working, some things aren't. And so there's a big study that went ahead, and it looked where we need to shore things up, where we need to fix some of the holes. And one of the areas they recommended was focusing on the near shore and the shallow water environment, because that's where underwater grasses are, that's where the oysters are, that's where the fish are. And so some of the ways they were looking at that was to focus on some of these areas, but do a series of restoration projects in some of these watersheds where you have multiple actions, whether it's oysters and actions on land to reduce nutrients, and even working with the community through environmental justice. The idea is pick some of these watersheds that may be close to coming back, or ones that are farther off, but put a series of actions in there that the end result is better near shore and shallow water habitat. So that's kind of in its infancy, but they just signed that order just recently. So we're trying to figure out how to make that work and keep pushing forward to get a cleaner and healthier bay.
Good stuff. Well, what I've wondered about, I'm glad we got projects like that going on, but when I was a kid, everybody walked around with this like save the bay mentality. And I really just I don't feel like I see that today. What happened? How do we get that back? Jen, I think you're taking step one right there on the Rappahannock.
Well, maybe I just have a very hopeful mentality about this, but I still see it a lot. Maybe it's just the people I associate with the area I'm in, but generally everyone I run into in the community, and again, I'm in a very rural area, but where a lot of people are directly affected by the water, or like Tom mentioned, a lot of people are out there enjoying the water. We have the access to do that, which is amazing, and I think might make it a little easier for people to have that idea of save the bay. But so many people know about like organizations like Chesapeake Bay Foundation or Friends of the Rappahannock, groups like you all who are doing this sort of work and support it and are excited to let us know they support it. You know, a lot of people want to be involved in this from what I've seen. Of course, I can't say I run into many people when I'm out representing a nonprofit who are like, no, but I mean, luckily I've seen a lot of enthusiasm. And again, I really think education and that enjoyment of the water is a huge promising aspect to get people on board with this.
All right, cool. Well, I want to ask you folks a scary question, okay? Because I don't know the answer to this. And people, we did not discuss this question, so they don't even know this is coming. But I've often wondered this. We're trying to save the bay. We've been trying to save the bay. When I was a little kid, we were trying to save the bay, right? As Tom mentioned earlier, we've actually managed to not let it get a whole lot worse, even as the population is just, built and built and built and built, which in a way is a kind of a win, right?
Yeah.
We've been treading water, but at least we haven't lost ground as there's been more and more and more development. But is anybody, are any of you aware of any examples of real success stories where you can look at a major estuary that was really degraded and had a lot of problems, and actually they turned it around and brought it back? And that can be with SAVs, with oysters, with water quality in general. I don't care, people. Give me some hope. Have some examples for me. Tom, please.
Okay. So here's a local one, and I know folks aren't even going to expect this, but Back River. Back River's got, the wastewater treatment plant there. What comes off of that river is essentially, that's the Baltimore City watershed coming off there. And, for many, many years, those waters were, when we look at our monitoring information, high levels of algae in there, and so there'd be low oxygen in there. We did some work in there, but what they've been working on is reducing the nutrients coming in addition to the wastewater treatment plant, which has had some hiccups recently. But through those reductions, I remember talking to the local folks there, and they said, we just learned something new that we've never seen before. We never realized that ducks had feet. And I was like, what do you mean? And they said, the water is getting clearer. We can actually see the duck's feet. There's some local conservation groups, and they said, because the water is clear, they go around and pull out trash out of the water. They pulled out record numbers of boats and trash in there because they can see farther into the water. And while obviously Back River isn't back to what we would consider, a pristine river, but the fact that if a place like that can see improvements, that's certainly that's a good sign.
Okay, fair enough. I like it. What do you think, Brooke, Jen? You have any other examples you want to pitch out there?
Well, I'll say, I think the Chesapeake Bay, it has gone through periods of like major degradation, and some people see that side more than they see the good, but really, we do have thriving grass beds still. They're not everywhere, and we haven't reached our goals, but we have a lot of SAV in the bay. And
would you please come to the South River and help me out?
Well, not in the South River.
I am not happy with the state of the SAV in the South River, dang it.
Yeah, like
Why?
you said, you get the spring grass, but
what's the deal? Why?
I'm not sure. It's been a mystery why the South is not.
Okay, can we make that a project?
Yeah, actually, we have stuff in the works for SAV restoration. In the South River. So
I like it.
But yeah, I think in the Chesapeake Bay, as Tom alluded to earlier, just the fact that it hasn't gotten worse considering the increase in human and animal population and the development. we're winning. In my opinion, I think we need to do more. That's not to say that, we're good to go and, we can all take a break. But I think, we've been fighting an uphill battle and doing all right,
That's true.
for grasses anyway.
What scares me is in my short lifespan, because I'm not very old, I'm about 30. In my short lifespan, I've seen the bay improve to the point that I thought I was seeing the Save the Bay world, and then it started to go down again. But again, it all really revolved around rainfall. When we had those really heavy rains, those heavy spring rains, was it like, I'm not sure how long ago it was, 6, 8, 10 years ago, we just started getting these torrential spring rains, and man, it just zapped us.
Yeah. From 2018 to 2019, we lost about 1/3 of our grasses in the bay because of that.
Whoa, no way.
The onslaught. And that's something we're going to have to grapple with
Wow.
climate change.
And Fred, did we see Fred's comment there? He said in the 60s, the South River was full of grass. So I don't know what happened between then and now. Well, then John Page is bringing up the grass beds in the Severn. He's saying they disappeared in the 80s. Or oysters in Lafayette River in Norfolk. Look at the bass fisheries in the upper tidal Potomac, James River. Okay, that's all fair. Reds and specks in the Norfolk River. Okay, that's all good stuff. Now, particularly, John Page knows like everything there is to know about the Severn River. So if he says there were no grasses there in the 80s and they came back, I'm darn sure he was right. Tom, I think you wanted to chime in on something there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely listen to John Page. I've got a whole bunch of his books on my in my library, and he knows his stuff. I mean, so he also pointed to the Potomac, and one of the things we've known from monitoring, one of the in my shop, what we look at is we work with a bunch of folks that we monitor all the areas of Maryland's tidal waters, and looking at these since back in the mid 80s, we know that. Through upgrading wastewater treatment plants, we've seen reductions in this algae food. And so we can see, statistically, trend-wise, that food has been reducing. In some areas, the phosphorus too. And so the Potomac River is a good example too of some of the areas that have shown improvements. At times we're having hiccups, but that is something we've seen across the board throughout Maryland. Wastewater treatment plants have definitely stepped up and reduced algae food.
Tom, I got to tell you, one of the most fascinating dichotomies I've ever seen in my life is on the western branch of the Patuxent River.
Yes.
You go up that river.
And it's crystal clear.
Until you go up the western branch, and then the water starts to get clear, and it gets cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, and then you get to the wastewater treatment plant, and the water coming out of it is crystal clear, and then you go beyond it, and it's all muddied up again.
Yep.
It's almost mind-blowing. And that stretch of the river is chock full of fish.
Yep.
Right where that wastewater, I don't know what they call it. It kind of sprays out in a way. Right where that mechanism is, it sprays that water in and then it runs into the river. There are schools of fish sitting there, like enjoying the clean, clear water. It's kind of weird. It's bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, I know in rivers that have that the flow is dominated by these wastewater treatment plants, they're seeing the improvements faster. So yeah, it's one of the big success stories of bay restoration is and that was really the easy thing was cleaning up the wastewater treatment plants.
Right. Well, I've heard that referred to before as the low hanging fruit, right? Because it was point source, right? Yep. You can identify it and you can say this is where it's coming from. And certainly through the years, there has been a lot of effort put into that. But what's interesting is all three of you, I've heard a lot of you, everybody really has kind of concurred on the fact that it's the individual homeowner here, that really, needs to make a change and where some attention needs to be paid. And I think it was maybe Jen who was saying earlier that it's almost more difficult because everything's so scattered. You're dealing with so many different people. You're not dealing with an entity, a government, a community. You're dealing with just lots and lots of people. So that's interesting. We are getting down to the wire. Zach, if we got any more questions, let's get them up now, sooner rather than later, so we don't miss people's questions. And I know you got a bunch of comments to go through. So while you're looking through there, I'm going to go to Brooke, and I'm going to ask you, Brooke, what is your favorite entity working to improve Chesapeake Bay habitat and why?
Well, is it weird to say Maryland DNR?
No, that's great. I love it. I love it.
CCA is great also, but the Maryland Department of Natural Resources is, in my opinion, as an employee of the state, I think we're doing a stellar job. We as a unit at DNR, we do a lot of SAV restoration, and we do a ton of restoration for all sorts of habitats and whatnot. But the Chesapeake Bay program also, I do a lot with the Bay program, and they're a phenomenal, organization that is really pushing, the entire purpose of the Bay program is to restore the Bay. And but aside from the federal and state agencies, my honest to God favorite are the water keepers and the river keepers. I don't think they get quite enough kudos. But every opportunity I get, I want a shout out to all the river keepers out there, because they're the ones connecting to the communities and the people, and they're educating and they're volunteering and they're helping us with water quality monitoring. They're helping us with SAV restoration, and they're really a huge essential connection to the Bay that they're doing a ton of good. So
that's awesome.
River keepers and watershed.
I like your pick, Brooks, and I love that you started with the DNR. And I got to say, some time ago, I might have argued with you on that point, but under the new administration, under the new secretary, Josh Kurtz, I really think that from all outward appearances, there's a real, people care now. Again.
Yes.
And I love it. Jen, what say you? What's your favorite? All right, this is a loaded question for you, right? What's your favorite organization?
Yeah. Of course, I love FOR. But I'm going to kind of widen that scope and do something that FOR is a part of, which is the Chesapeake Oyster Alliance. So obviously I'm a little oyster biased, even though Friends of the Rappahannock does more things than that. But this alliance is the collaboration of so many different groups in the Chesapeake Bay region, all with the same focus of helping with oyster restoration, outreach, education, everything surrounding oysters. And just this past week, they passed their 100th partner. So rapidly growing, doing great, and doing some awesome things for oyster restoration in the Bay.
So the Alliance. So I'm not sure that is one of the links we had prepped, Zach, but we're going to put you to the test and see how good you are and how quick you can come up with a link while we divert the question to Tom.
So I'm going to take the easy answer, and I'm going to say it's not one organization. It's anybody who has enjoyed these amazing waters and is trying to help out and trying to educate too, because it's sometimes one of the hardest things we found is making people understand with what we're doing and why a restored bay matters. And so what you're doing here, Lenny, with Dave and, other folks support all those groups that are supporting, is helping people understand the bay, how it works, why it's important, and why they should care and work together to preserve this amazing place. So, a restored bay, it's more than just, I certainly love fishing, and I will always love it for more and better fishing. But a cleaner bay also helps with improves our drinking water. It makes it cheaper to improve our drinking water quality. It provides more jobs, improves seafood. All the folks that that rely on the bay for their livelihoods. A clean bay does all this sorts of stuff. We have, they even show that on shorelines, a cleaner bay improves home values. It does so many different things. And so what you're doing here, letting everybody hear about the issues for the bay and understanding that it's important to, take ownership and advocate for the bay. So that's what I appreciate yourself and others that are on the front lines trying to spread the word.
Well, I tell you what, man, I just hope things get better and better and better, because when I think of all the potential the bay has, it blows my mind. People travel all around the world to go see, eco-touring. And I've been on some of these eco-tours in different continents, And I walk around and I look around and I go, yeah, we got that beat. Even in the bay's current state, we got that beat. It's just amazing. Zach, last call for questions, because we really do kind of need to wrap things up. We are down to the wire here. We don't want to wear out our welcome. Everybody, thank you so much for joining in. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank our viewers. I also want to extend a special thanks to Dave Sikorsky and Chris Dollar for coming up with this concept in the first place and then pushing to make it happen. They made it happen. And of course, we got to give a big thanks to Zach Ditmars, our wizard behind the curtain. He came up with that link pretty quick, didn't he? He just whipped that thing out. Zach makes it happen. He is Fish Talk's kayak angling guru, our production manager, and all things tech. He is the man. So thank you, Zach, for making that happen. And folks, I think with the timing, we're going to have to close it out. And, this was our final Chesapeake Perspective for 2023. People, I hope everybody found it informative and interesting. And if you happen to watch this at a later date after our live broadcast, please still feel free to add to the comments below. I want you to. Please, let's keep this conversation going. Thank you, everybody. And good night.